Hello, I thought I'd make a video or two just in preparation for the first exam, just briefly gazing over the things that we've read so far. This is not meant to be comprehensive or a substitute for actually reading over the material, but just looking at some highlights and emphasizing certain aspects or themes of what we read. We started with the NSP Code of Ethics. Didn't read it in detail, I just wanted to get familiar with the whole idea of a code of ethics, especially for a professional code, which is sort of the guideline of this course, the idea of a profession and what ethical obligations that may actually bring with it. The idea is that engineering is a profession, and that is indicated in the first line of the preamble right here. The presumption is that it's a profession. Engineering is an important and learned profession. And really, everything is supposed to flow from that. That is, as human beings, we are presumably subject to restrictions in our behavior of an ethical nature, certain imperatives perhaps that we must follow. That all applies. But the whole reason for engineering ethics is the idea that engineering is a profession, and that as a result of that, or you can see it right here in the accordingly in the preamble, as a result of the status of engineering as a profession, then certain specific ethical duties or imperatives flow from that. That's the whole idea of the course, really. And in looking at the structure of the Code of Ethics, you've got three sections here. You've got the fundamental canons, and then you have the rules of practice. And the important thing to remember is that the rules of practice are specifications of the fundamental canons, right? So each section of the rule of practice starts with a restatement of the canon, and then you have specifications of the canon, elaborations on the canon, interpretations of the canon, you might say. And we're familiar with what they are. Obviously, in this course, we are focusing especially on canons 1 and 4. And those are the ones you really have to simply know. You have to know that the first canon is the one about public safety. You have to know that the fourth canon is the one about acting as a faithful agent or trustee of your client or employer. There's no substitute for that. I don't think that it's necessary for me to remind anybody of the content of the first canon when I mention the first canon, and likewise with the fourth canon. They're that important, so that's simply. And the other canons are interesting too and important. It's just we don't really have time to explore them in any depth. So really, you might say that looking at least for the purposes of this course or for the exam, looking at the NSP Code of Ethics, the most important thing is to remember the content of the first and fourth canons. Let's see. We moved on to what? BER case? Yes, this sort of not trivial BER case, but a BER case that I thought is sort of taking it slow, right? Not moving to the most earth-shaking matters in engineering ethics, but looking at this comparatively small matter of a 01 or 101-10 employment expense paid trip by prospective employers, which we discussed, I think, pretty thoroughly in class. Really, it has to do with what? Specifically, I'm not sure what it has to do with in terms of engineering ethics. It hasn't anything to do specifically with engineering ethics. It has to do with, I suppose, a certain idea of professional conduct. It's clear that what this young engineer did was suspicious or suspect ethically. They're doing something that many of us would do, taking advantage of a situation to our own gain, in which the stakes are pretty small. No one's going to die or be endangered as a result of what this engineer did. It doesn't really specifically have to do with engineering. It has to do with integrity, really. If you're the kind of person who's going to take advantage of a prospective employer like this, then maybe you need to rethink whether you should be a professional. It's an interesting case, I think. Again, it's not that important. And anybody who did this certainly wouldn't be sanctioned or drummed out of the profession because they took advantage of this one employer to get a free trip. It's just not that big a deal. But I think that there's some interesting things that are said here. At the end, negotiation of an employment agreement is among the first of many professional challenges a young engineer faces, and wisdom says it is appropriate to seek the ethical highway as opposed to the back trails when one is starting off on a career. There is a degree of deception, maybe admittedly a small degree of deception in what this engineer did. And that is cited in the references. Engineers, Canon 5, engineers shall avoid deceptive acts. Not that it was any kind of really incredibly important deceptive act, but it was an act of deception, at least insofar as the engineer must have known that it was unlikely that he would have been offered this trip if the prospective employer if it had been fully disclosed, if his state of mind or his intentions had been fully disclosed. And that's really the error that he made, and according to the board, is that he couldn't have taken this trip without disclosing that he had really no intention of accepting an offer from that company. It was just unethical to do that. Again, was it the biggest thing in the world? No, but I like reading it in the beginning of a course in professional ethics to get a kind of sense of the tone of it, right? That is that maybe as a professional, a certain higher standard of conduct is expected of you, is the idea. I think that here on the first week, we also read Sieghart's Profession as the Conscience of Society. I will not go over this in much detail. I think we discussed it thoroughly in class, and it would take too long to do so. So I'm going to just say a few things about it. And again, not indicating that this is sort of the thorough reading of it that you need to do. What is Sieghart really offering in this essay? I think he's offering a lot of things of value. He is giving you, to some degree, a definition of what a profession actually is. But he is also trying to provide a basis for professional ethics in general. And after giving us a certain theory of ethics, that ethics is founded in human relationships, and especially human relationships in which we have to make a choice between acting selfishly and acting altruistically, that the professional ethics is founded upon a certain type of relationship, and that's the professional-client relationship. And because of the special nature of that relationship, the professional is always expected to act altruistically when it comes to the client. And that is founded presumably on the what he calls the vast inequality of power, or the gross inequality of power between the professional and the client. The professional has every opportunity to take advantage of the client because of their position. They're the strong one. They're the one who has the skills, the knowledge, and the client is the one that's weak, the one that's in need, that is calling upon the professional for help. So that the worst thing that a professional can do is to take advantage of that situation. And the professional is expected to always act altruistically. That may be stating it a little bit too broadly, but I think that it makes an important point. And it emphasizes that the the real essence of the idea of profession is service. That is, that if an occupation like engineering or teaching or medicine, if it can't really make a claim to be acting primarily in the service of human welfare in some way, then it's not really a profession. If it's just something that you need to know a lot to do, or it's something that you have to have really special skills to do, or just to have really rare abilities to do, that's not enough. It has to be something where there's a dedication to service. And that's something that a professional athlete or a professional gambler or even a professional musician couldn't really claim to be doing. Whereas it's at least plausible when it comes to medicine, law, the clergy, and I would say also with engineering because of the importance of technology in modern life. So the idea is that, as he says, altruism is paramount and self-interest has no place in the professional relationship. Of course, the other really important idea that he suggests is at the heart of a profession is the idea of the noble cause. And he says that the noble cause is even more important, really, than the duty to altruism, because the noble cause, in some cases, will trump it, will outweigh it. And he gives a strange scenario of the doctor who knows that he could help his patient if he poisoned somebody who was bothering his patient, which of course he couldn't do. And Singhart suggests that that's because it would violate the noble cause of medicine, which is health, the promotion of health. Poisoning somebody, even if it would help your client, would violate that noble cause. And it suggests that there are different noble causes for different professions. Health, justice for lawyers. I think that the engineering ethics codes are the only ones that actually enshrine that noble cause in the code, and that is the health, safety, and welfare of the public. So clearly, engineering has a strong claim to have what Singhart would regard as a noble cause. Of course, we looked at Downey's critique of Singhart, which is important and also illuminating. And he thinks that Singhart is confused, and that the first confusion is really this notion of altruism. He's not sure how Singhart means the claim. Like, is it an empirical claim that professionals do act altruistically? Is it a, what does he say? It is a conceptual claim? Is it a moral claim? Right. The confusions arise from the running together of empirical, conceptual, and moral claims. Clearly, it can't be an empirical claim because doctors and lawyers don't always act altruistically in actuality. Could be a conceptual claim in that, well, when doctors and lawyers are acting as doctor and lawyers, it's always in the service of somebody. But that's true of all jobs. And when you're actually doing the job, it's for the betterment of someone else. So that couldn't be definitive. The last one is the moral claim. And he says at the bottom of the first page, if the point is thirdly that morally speaking, doctors and lawyers ought not to aim at self-interest in the form of exorbitant fees, then that is true. And equally, those in other occupations ought not to aim at self-interest in the form of undue profits. That is, even if it's just a moral claim that this is the way that professionals should behave, well, that's actually not any different from the way that everyone else ought to behave. So it wouldn't be a sufficient condition for being a professional. He has some pretty strong criticisms of the whole noble cause thing. Again, the basic idea being that the noble cause really can't be definitive of a profession because Many other occupations could claim to have a noble cause, not just the traditional professions. Basically, trying to puncture the whole balloon here of special ethical duties on the part of professionals. He just doesn't think that they exist. We did, I think, look at Sieghart's response to Downey, which I thought was quite interesting, actually. Where he, just basically defends some of the things that he said. He wasn't really speaking. He wasn't speaking to philosophers, so he wasn't being as careful, perhaps, in the kind of distinctions that he was making. I think that one of the most important things that he says in his defense is this idea that his point about altruism, rather than being an empirical, conceptual, or moral claim, he says it's a perceptual claim, which I find very interesting. So the idea is perceptual rather than conceptual. He says, what I was trying to convey was that this was how most people in most societies expect their true professionals to behave. Now, Downey himself said that the idea of a profession is rough around the edges. It's historical in nature, that it may be impossible to actually provide an objective definition of what a profession is. It may be that it's more historical in the sense that it has to do with the way people have come to perceive certain job occupations like law and medicine. And I think that that's a pretty strong point, actually. That is that it may be that when we come down to trying to define, say, why medicine is different as a profession than other things that we would say aren't professions, a lot of it has to do with our expectations of doctors. That is, there are plenty of things that maybe in our business lives or consumer lives we wouldn't like business associates or companies or others to do, but we wouldn't say that they had somehow violated any kind of deep ethical principle, whereas we would in terms of doctors, lawyers, and perhaps engineers, that we may have higher expectations of them because we perceive those jobs as being different. And if we do perceive those jobs being different, there's probably some reason to set them apart, and perhaps the word professional wouldn't be out of place. Where are we, week 2 or week 3? I think we're in week 2 still, right? Sorry this is going on so long, but I think we looked at yes, the 05-3, interesting case, which we discussed pretty thoroughly, I think, having to do with an engineer just not returning the messages from his client. And again, I like looking at a case like this. It's not such a big deal, but it does point up the obligations that professionals have. It's probably not a good idea to, in any business situation, to not get back to people when they leave you messages, but it doesn't rise to the level of being an ethical lapse. Whereas if you're a professional and you don't communicate about things with your patients, your clients, then that's an ethical failure, because you're basically failing in your fourth canon duties. I mean, you don't have any fourth canon duties to customers or business associates. You have maybe other kinds of minimal ethical obligations to them, but nothing like a fourth canon duty. When you take on somebody as a client, you're now their agent. You're acting in their interests, and you're acting in their service. And at the very least, that means that you have to be in some kind of regular contact with them if it's relevant, which it certainly was in this case. So I just thought it's a good case to point out that difference. If it was just a normal business thing, it would just be bad business. But because it's a professional relationship, it rises to the level of an ethical matter. Let's see, week 3. Yes, okay. Well, Spindon. Spindon is a big gulp, let's face it. It's a long thing, and maybe too long, but it makes an important point. And Spindon's basic thesis, which is well documented by the long opening sections, which have to do with the history of engineering in America and the history of the struggle for and against licensure of engineers in America, But what's the big idea in Spindon? That the industrial exemption is a disaster for everybody, but especially for the profession of engineering. That the industrial exemption, which we know, is the idea that every state pretty much requires engineers to get licensed. So on paper, all engineers should be professional engineers. Should be licensed by the state. Should be PEs. But the vast majority of them operate on under one exemption or another from that requirement to be licensed. The biggest exemption being the industrial exemption. That is, if you work in what's called ancillary, or if you work for a company and the company's main product is not engineering but something else, like a car, or a cell phone or something, but you're doing engineering for that company, it's called ancillary engineering. The idea is, and so under those conditions, you don't have to, if you work for that company, then you don't have to get your license. Of course, there are other exemptions too. I think working for state or local government, working for a utility, working under a PE at an engineering firm, things like that. I don't want to get into it's a very complicated situation because obviously licensure means something different in different fields. I think, as you've told me, it's really mad. The licensing thing is really for civil engineers mostly, I guess. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for people in other areas. But his idea is that it's the lack of a licensing requirement, which is at the heart of engineering's failure to really be widely, fully, universally accepted as a profession. And that moreover, it's bad for the public because the licensing requirement would be a spur to more ethical behavior on the part of engineers. Doesn't he go through? Yes, he does go through. He does dig up the Challenger disaster and infamous moment where one of the engineers who's in a decision-making position is asked to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat, which is widely pointed to as emblematic of what went wrong with the Challenger incident. That is, the engineers stopped thinking like engineers and started thinking more like managers. And I think Spindon's point is that if licensure was a more widespread thing, then it would act as what he calls the looming omnipresence. That is, that it would be that one's professional duties would be more prominent than one's, let's say, employee duties. That is, that it would be more clear, perhaps, to engineers, or more prominent in their minds, that their first duty was to the profession and therefore to the public and therefore to service, rather than their first duty erroneously being thought to their employer, which is perhaps one of the reasons that the Challenger thing went ahead. It's a long essay. You should at least read the part at the end, which is really where he makes his point. The first part is really kind of just making a foundation in history, but the second part is really, in his argument against the guy who's defending the industrial exemption, which is an interesting argument. The guy who defends the industrial exemption on the basis that engineers who work for large corporations, that they cannot be thought of as being in any danger to the public because their companies take responsibility for their work, which is an interesting argument, and Spindon thinks it's an inadequate argument because it doesn't really protect the public. It just means that somebody with deep pockets is able to pay once the damage has been done. Right? Extremely interesting and important article, I think, if we're interested in the idea of engineering as a profession. Okay, the last two major things that we read, Kipnis and DeGeorge, and then maybe a couple of couple of BER cases. Well, engineers who kill. Okay. Great title, obviously. Classic essay in engineering ethics. What is he trying to do? He's giving you an interpretation of the first canon, and this is really what this section of the course is about. The first canon, engineers shall hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. What does that mean? Well, he gives you an interpretation of what it means, and perhaps the most important thing that he does is at the beginning of the essay makes this distinction between the ideal of the profession and the principle of professional conduct, which is the first canon. It is both. Although it's in its guise as the latter, the principle of professional conduct, that he'll be concerned in the essay. An ideal of the profession is an aspirational ideal. We could read the first canon as something that should spur engineers on to greater and greater service, but it's not something that can be violated as an aspirational ideal. You can shoot for it, but if you miss it, no one can say that you did wrong. Whereas a principle of professional conduct is something that we could actually say is capable of being violated. And really, the essay is devoted to specifying the criteria for what it would mean to actually violate it as a principle of professional conduct. And that's what the real interest of this essay is. The most important idea in that is the idea of menace, acting as a menace. Great, the car alarm's going off outside. Don't you love car alarms? It was worse back in the 90s. They would just go all night. This one will stop soon because, or maybe it won't. Pretty soon you won't even hear it anymore. We'll just be so used to this car alarm. Or maybe not. Yeah. What do you think the car alarm industry, think they've got any professional duties to the public? I don't think so. Their duty is to make life awful for everyone. Really? Okay, I'm going to stop for a while.